what I've noticed is I look at my stats every year. It's never the superstars who get the biggest downloads. It's never the people who have big names, big audiences, big followings. It's never them because they've been interviewed a million times, right? So I interviewed the creator of the company behind League of Legends. It's huge. There are people who watch their games more people watch their what
Twitch
is it called? I forget the event. One of their big annual events. More people watch that than the Super Bowl. And still, so he obviously has a massive following. He obviously created something that's huge. The problem is when I Googled his name and the word interview, I came up with 660,000 hits, right? Which tells me that I'm not the only one. It doesn't really make enough of an impact. Meanwhile, if I'll interview a small entrepreneur who does especially well in a community, boom, that community will send new people in addition to the fact that if they've already vetted that person and they like them in that community, they're a good indicator that the rest of the community that other people like them will like them. So, for example, if someone on Indie Hackers just blows up, Indie Hackers is big now in the tech startup scene. If I see that there's someone everyone's talking about who's like this unknown small person they're all rooting for, reach out to that person. I get them to say yes to doing an interview. And now that community on Indie Hacker says, hey, there's our guy who's now on Mixergy. And they go and listen. And they're also good indicators of what the rest of the startup world will think. If they've considered this person and they like them, other entrepreneurs would like.
So when you say star, that's an interesting delineation. If you say stars, you're saying stars in the community, not necessarily the star who started the community. And I actually lived through what you just said. Like when we were featured on the Smart Passive Income podcast with Pat Flynn on episode 122, and it blew up. It straight exploded. And for years, we were the most downloaded episode of this SPI podcast, like more than like Gary Vee or any of those guys, because we were just two people from Kentucky randomly who started this website, and it blew up. And then we have found that in our community. Like even in this podcast, I interview a lot of amazing people. My other podcast significantly can get more downloads because I'm interviewing normal people from my community. Like I got this guy named Kenny Triano. He joined my community and he launched this membership site about raising backyard chickens. Like he has this huge community of backyard chicken raisers. It's hilarious. And it's by far one of the most downloaded episodes of anything I've ever put out there because it's a dude making a living on chickens in his backyard. Like that's fascinating. And he wasn't featured anywhere else. So there's no real competition for that story.
Yeah. I think of it as you have the monopoly on the chicken dude. Anyone who cares about that, you are quote. The person that they're going to. For me, one of the people that I've got a monopoly on is a guy named Andrew Burnett Thompson. He's a guy who all he does is doesn't sound sexy, doesn't sound like it would be a big attraction. He owns a company called SideChart. Like, who would know that the guy who owns a software that makes charts for other software makers would be at all interesting? But he told the story online, and what he did was he had to work nights and weekends to teach himself to code. He would literally be on the train to work with a laptop trying to code up his site, right? You picture that dude. And the thing worked and it started producing real money. And so people in the startup community went and saw him or read his story and liked it. And I knew then that there was an appetite for him. I interviewed him. He became a much bigger guest than any of my other guests for 2019. So wow. That's the thing that we're looking for. You want to have a monopoly on these people that are incredibly exciting for a small group of people that matter. But I will say this too. I should say too, that we also want superstars. We want the superstars, the people who are recognizable, whose name will stand out, whose name you could put on your website, who when you're saying I interviewed and you list them, people say, oh, I know them and say, I want to be interviewed by Shane. I want to be interviewed by Andrew because Andrew interviewed them.